The morning sun crept through the curtains, casting a warm glow on the small, cluttered room. Sarah sat at her desk, her eyes glued to the computer screen where a philosophical debate was unfolding in real time. She had stumbled upon a discussion about God's will and the existence of evil. As she read, her mind raced with questions that seemed to challenge everything she had ever believed. One of the posts caught her attention immediately. It was from a user named Divine Paradox, who wrote, "What if God in his infinite wisdom actually wills that evil happen?" Sarah's heart skipped a beat. How could this be? Wasn't God supposed to be all good and all loving? How could he possibly want evil to exist? According to them, God's decretive will includes the existence of evil. But his perceptive will is that humans should not commit evil. Sarah's mind was reeling. This idea seemed to contradict everything she had been taught. She had always believed that God was good and that evil was a result of human free will. But now, she was faced with the possibility that God himself might have a role in the existence of evil. As she delved deeper into the debate, she encountered several objections to the two wills concept. One of the most prominent objections came from a user named Walls. He argued that if God decrees evil, then it must be justified by its consequences. This, Walls claimed, made God a consequentialist, someone who believes that the ends justify the means. But Sarah knew that consequentialism wasn't what Calvinists were saying. Calvinists believe that God has the proper authority and good purposes for allowing evil, but it doesn't mean that the evil acts themselves are right. Another user, Rogers, raised a different objection. She argued that if God has a secret will that goes against his revealed will, then God must be deceptive. But Sarah realized that this was a misunderstanding. God's secret will isn't about being secretive or untrustworthy. It's about having a greater plan that humans can't fully understand. God's revealed will is what he has made clear to us, and our duty is to follow it. Sarah's thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. It was her friend, Mike, who had come over to study. "Hey, what's up? You look deep in thought," he said, noticing the intensity in her eyes. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then decided to share what she had been reading. "Mike, have you ever thought about why evil exists? What if God actually wills it to happen?" Mike's eyebrows raised in surprise. "That's a heavy question. I always thought evil was just a result of human choices." Sarah nodded. "I used to think that too, but I just read something that made me question everything. Some people believe that God has two wills. One is what he commands us to do, and the other is what he ultimately decrees to happen, even if it includes evil." Mike leaned back in his chair, processing the idea. "That's a lot to take in. It makes me wonder, though, if God really does have a plan for everything, even the bad stuff." Sarah nodded, her mind still racing. "Exactly. It's a tough pill to swallow, but it makes me think about God in a whole new way." "What do you think?" Mike shrugged. "I don't know. It's a lot to consider, but maybe it's worth exploring after all. If God is really in control of everything, then maybe there's a reason for everything, even the things we don't understand." Sarah smiled, feeling a sense of relief. She wasn't alone in her confusion. Together they decided to dive deeper into the debate, eager to uncover the truth about God's will and the existence of evil. As they began to explore the complex ideas and arguments, Sarah felt a new sense of purpose. She was determined to find answers, even if it meant challenging everything she had ever believed. The journey ahead was uncertain, but she was ready to face it head on. On one hand, There's a way to talk about permission that's all about God's plans and has nothing to do with right or wrong. It's like when God lets something happen, or doesn't let it happen, but it's not about whether it's good or bad. For example, in the Bible, there's a part where Paul and Silas wanted to go to a place called Bithynia, but the Spirit of Jesus didn't let them. It's not that going to Bithynia was bad or that going to Troas, where they ended up, was good. It was just God's plan. This kind of permission is different from what some people are talking about when they say God lets evil happen. When people talk about God letting evil happen, they mean something more. They think God should stop evil, but sometimes doesn't. This idea of permission is about God being passive, like standing by and not doing anything to stop something bad. It's like God is not getting involved when He could. To understand this better, let's think about a real-life example. Imagine a burglar is climbing a ladder to break into a house. A passerby sees this and has a choice. The passerby can either push the ladder to stop the burglar, or do nothing and let the burglar continue. If the passerby pushes the ladder, the burglar won't commit the crime. But if the passerby does nothing, the burglar will commit the crime. This situation shows us what we mean by permission in this context. The passerby has control over whether the crime happens, but the way they control it is different depending on their choice. If they stop the crime, they have to actively do something. If they let the crime happen, they just do nothing. Now, let's think about how this applies to God. God is different from the passerby in some important ways. For one, God isn't just watching the burglar. He's also the one who made the burglar's choices and character. So, when we talk about God permitting evil, it's not just about whether He stops it in the moment. It's also about how He set things up from the beginning. But even with these differences, we can still use the idea of permission to understand God's role in evil. One way to think about it is to use a pair of what-if statements. The first one is, if God actively intervened, the sinner would not commit the sin. The second one is, if God passively refrained from intervening, the sinner would commit the sin. These statements help us see the difference between God stopping evil and God letting it happen. For example, if God doesn't give a person grace, which is like a special kind of help, that person will sin because they are already inclined to do bad things. But if God does give grace, the person won't sin. This shows that God has control over whether the person sins, but the way He controls it can be different. If He gives grace, He actively stops the sin. If He doesn't give grace, He passively lets the sin happen. Some people might say, but what about good things? Can God also permit good things? Imagine a firefighter climbing a ladder to save a baby from a burning building. If a passerby doesn't kick the ladder, they are letting the fire do something good. This shows that sometimes not doing something can also be a way of allowing good things to happen. But the important thing is that the language of permission is still useful when talking about God and evil, even if it can also apply to good things in some cases. In the end, the idea of permission helps us understand how God can be in control of everything, but still let some things happen without being the cause of them. It's a way to explain the difference between God actively stopping evil and passively allowing it to happen, even in a world where God is in charge of everything. But secondly, let's fine-tune the idea to address the objection. We can say that a language of permission is excluded if God needs to actively intervene at the moment of choice to produce a righteous choice, or at any point in the past to shape a righteous character that naturally leads to choosing the good, Since original sin gives humans a natural inclination toward evil, any subsequent sin is just an expression of this original tendency and doesn't need God's intervention. However, any righteous deed is the result of a character that has been actively improved by God's direct intervention, whether at the moment of choice or at any point before it. This way, we can see a clear difference between every good action and every evil one after the fall. In this sense, all evil is permitted, and all good is actively extended. This idea helps us understand a statement by John Calvin. Simply to will is the part of man, to will ill the part of corrupt nature, to will well the part of grace. Now, we need to explain Adam's first sin. Since he hadn't fallen yet, we can't use original sin to explain his first inclination toward evil. But this doesn't mean our model fails. Without original sin, we might not have a simple explanation for Adam's first inclination toward evil, but it's clear that he had such an inclination. How could he have sinned if he didn't even want to? If we think about it in terms of what would happen, like the Molinists do, it's either that Adam would sin in the biblical situation, or he wouldn't. Since he did sin, it means that he would sin if God didn't give him extra grace to prevent the fall. So even if we don't have a simple explanation for why this is true, our model can still assume it and explain the difference in Adam's choice. He would sin if left to his own devices, and God passively allowed it, whether or not it was determined. Now, let's look at some objections from people who believe in free will, libertarians. William Lane Craig argues that if God causes someone to sin, it's like God is making them do it. God causes the agent to sin by moving his will to choose evil, which makes the allegation that God is the author of sin difficult to deny. But this doesn't fit with our model. On our view, God determines everything, but he only moves the will toward the good, working against the sinful nature. When it comes to sin, a fallen human will naturally choose evil without any special push from God. John Sanders has another objection. He thinks that permission means leaving multiple options open. The use of the word permission is problematic in the no-risk model. According to specific sovereignty, everything that occurs is precisely what God meticulously controls to occur. In this case, the term permission seems to mean the following. Suppose God had a rat that he wanted to run through a maze. Suppose further that every time the rat began to go down a path that God did not intend it to go, God placed a gate in its way that did not permit him to go that way. Eventually, the rat goes in the direction in which God permits, since other paths were closed, while comparing humans to rats isn't great. The main issue is that Sanders thinks permission requires leaving multiple paths open. But why? It's perfectly fine to say that by blocking paths, God is not permitting the rat to go down them. And by opening one, he is permitting the rat to go that way. The idea of leaving multiple options open isn't essential to the concept of permission. Jerry. Walls argues that permission means God should prefer a different choice. The problem is that permission language does not make much sense on compatibilist premises. Typically, to say an action is permitted implies that one is not controlling that action. For instance, parents may permit their children to make bad decisions that they would prefer them not to make. But on our view, God chooses and brings about every state of affairs, including evil, because it leads to a greater good. So, God prefers the greater good, even though he allows the evil to happen. It's like saying God would prefer not to have the evil, but he allows it because it's necessary for the greater good. William Hasker acknowledges that these concepts are coherent, but points out that God's involvement in evil is still decisive. No doubt, in this view, God permits evil actions without actively assisting them in the way that he assists good actions through his gracious influence. Nevertheless, the evil actions are the necessary consequences of causes that were deliberately created by God, with full knowledge of what their results would be. God's involvement may be less direct than in the case of good actions, but it is no less decisive. This is exactly the point. God's permission of evil is less active but no less decisive. This maintains the asymmetry between God's control of good and evil. Now, is permission language really necessary, and why? Some argue that permission language is required for Christians and that determinists can't use it. But we've shown that permission language is compatible with determinism. So, why should Calvinists use it? The Bible and the Reformed tradition sometimes use permission language to describe divine providence. If it's coherent and found in these sources, Calvinists should use it to describe God's disapproval of sin and the asymmetry in his actions, while still maintaining his full control over everything. Some Calvinists, like Bruce Ware and Terence Thiessen, have used the idea of God's knowledge of counterfactuals, what would happen in different situations, to explain this asymmetry. They call this Calvinist middle knowledge. This idea has been debated, but for our purposes, it's enough to say that God knows these counterfactuals, and this knowledge justifies the asymmetry and the use of permission language. In the end, this helps us refute the argument that determinism improperly involves God in evil. As the Bible says, is there injustice on God's part? By no means. Rom 9:14. Imagine you're trying to solve a big puzzle. You have all the pieces, but you're not sure how they fit together. That's a bit like trying to understand how God's plan fits with the choices we make. Some people believe that everything that happens is part of God's plan, and that even our choices are guided by God. This idea is called theological determinism. Others think that we have real free will, and God doesn't control everything we do. This chapter will help you understand both sides and see how they fit together. Theological determinism says that God has planned everything that happens, including our choices. This might sound strange, but let's break it down. If God is all-powerful and all-knowing, then he must know everything that will happen, and he must have a plan for it. This means that even when bad things happen, they are part of God's plan, even if we don't understand why. Now, you might be thinking, if God planned everything, does that mean we're not responsible for our actions? That's a great question. Even if God knows what we will do, we are still responsible for our choices. Think of it like this. When you play a video game, the game designer knows all the possible moves you can make, but you still choose what to do. Your choices matter, and you are still responsible for them. Another big question is, if God planned everything, including evil, does that make God responsible for evil? This is a tough one. The answer is that God is not guilty for the presence of evil, but he does have a purpose for it. Just like a story has a plot that includes both good and bad things, God's plan includes both good and bad things. The bad things are there for a reason, even if we don't always see it. One of the most important things to remember is that if everything is part of God's plan, then our salvation is also part of God's plan. This means that we can't take credit for being saved. It's not because we are better or made better choices. It's because God chose to save us. This should lead us to be humble and grateful rather than proud. When bad things happen, it can be hard to see why. But if you believe in theological determinism, you can take comfort in knowing that even the bad things have a purpose. God is in control, and he has a plan that is bigger than we can understand. This doesn't mean we should ignore or accept evil, but it does mean we can find hope in the midst of difficulties. Finally, remembering that God is in control and that our choices are part of His plan should make us more humble. We should be grateful for the good things in our lives and not take credit for them. We should also be patient and understanding when bad things happen, knowing that God has a purpose for it all. So whether you believe in theological determinism or not, the most important thing is to trust that God is good and that He has a plan. This plan includes both good and bad things, but it is all for a reason. We are responsible for our choices, and we should be humble in our salvation. By understanding these ideas, we can live with more peace and purpose, knowing that God is always with us, guiding us through life's journey. The debate between theological determinism and libertarian free will is a deep one, and it touches on some of the most fundamental questions of faith and philosophy. Let's break it down in a way that's easy to understand. When we talk about theological determinism, we mean the idea that God has a plan for everything, and every event, including human actions, is part of that plan. This is a core belief in Calvinism, a branch of Christianity named after John Calvin. On the other hand, libertarian free will suggests that humans have the genuine ability to make choices that are not predetermined by God, and these choices can lead to both good and evil. One of the key issues in this debate is the problem of evil. Why does evil exist if God is all-powerful and all-good? For Calvinists, the answer is that every instance of evil serves a specific purpose in God's plan. Even if we don't understand why, we can trust that God has a reason for it. This means that when bad things happen, a Christian can find comfort in knowing that it's part of God's plan, even if they don't know the exact reason. This can be a source of strength and purpose during tough times. On the other hand, if we believe in libertarian free will, evil can sometimes seem purposeless. God allows humans to make free choices, and some of these choices lead to evil. The idea is that free will is so important that God is willing to accept some evil to preserve it. This can be less satisfying because it means that some evil exists just because of the human capacity to choose freely, which might not seem like a good enough reason for all the suffering in the world. Another important aspect of this debate is moral responsibility. Calvinists believe that while God determines all human actions, humans are still responsible for their choices. This means that even though God is in control, people can still be held accountable for their actions. This idea is rooted in the belief that God's grace is what enables people to make good choices, and without this grace, they would not be able to do good. This leads to a strong sense of humility, as people recognize that their good deeds are not their own achievement, but a result of God's work in their lives. However, this can also lead to a tricky question. If God determines everything, why should people be praised for good deeds or blamed for bad ones? Calvinists argue that people are still morally responsible because they are the ones making the choices, even if God is ultimately behind those choices. This means that while people can be praised for good actions and blamed for bad ones, they should always remember that their ability to make these choices comes from God. This idea of moral responsibility also extends to the concept of salvation. Calvinists believe that salvation is not based on human merit, but on God's grace. People are saved, not because they are better or more righteous, but because God chose them for salvation. This means that the saved can't boast about their salvation, as it is entirely due to God's grace. This leads to a deep sense of gratitude and humility, as people recognize that their salvation is a gift from God. In contrast, Arminians who believe in libertarian free will might argue that people have a role in their own salvation through their faith and good works. This can lead to a sense of personal achievement, but it can also make people feel more responsible for their salvation, which can be both a burden and a source of pride. The key keyhays from this debate is that both views offer different ways of understanding God's role in the world and human responsibility. Calvinism provides a strong foundation for humility and trust in God's plan, while libertarian free will emphasizes the importance of human choice and responsibility. Both perspectives have their strengths and can help people find meaning and purpose in their lives, even in the face of suffering and evil. Throughout this book, we've explored some of the most profound and complex questions about God, free will, and human responsibility. From ancient philosophers to modern theologians, we've seen a wide range of perspectives on these topics. Let's take a moment to reflect on what we've learned and how it all fits together. We started by looking at the idea of free will. Some thinkers, like Alvin Plantinga and Robert Caine, argue that free will is essential for moral responsibility. They believe that if our actions are determined by external forces, we can't truly be held responsible for them. Others, like David Hume and Paul Helm, suggest that free will and determinism can coexist. They argue that even if our actions are influenced by factors beyond our control, we can still be morally responsible for them. We also delved into the nature of God and how different views of God affect our understanding of free will. For example, John Calvin and his followers believe in a sovereign God who determines everything, including human actions. This view, called Calvinism, suggests that God's sovereignty is absolute and free will is limited. On the other hand, thinkers like Clark Pinnock and William Hasker propose a more open view of God, where God allows for human free will and interacts with the world in a dynamic way. This view, known as open theism, emphasizes God's responsiveness and the importance of human choice. One of the most challenging topics we covered is the problem of evil. If God is all-powerful and all-good, why is there evil in the world? Some, like Alvin Plantinga, propose the free will defense, which suggests that God allows evil to preserve human free will. Others, like Wayne Grudem, argue that God uses evil for a greater good, even if we can't always see it. Still, others, like Roger Olson and Jerry Walls, find these explanations unsatisfying and argue for a different understanding of God's nature and sovereignty. We also discussed the concept of middle knowledge, which is the idea that God knows what free creatures would do in any given situation. This idea, proposed by Luis de Molina, tries to reconcile God's foreknowledge with human free will. Some, like Paul Helm, reject this idea, while others, like Kenneth Keithley, find it helpful in understanding divine providence. Throughout our journey, we've seen that these questions are deeply intertwined. Our understanding of God, free will, and human responsibility shapes how we see the world and our place in it. Whether we believe in a sovereign God who determines all things, or a responsive God who works with human free will, these views have significant implications for our lives and our faith. In the end, the discussions in this book show us that there are many ways to approach these complex issues. Some answers may resonate more with you than others, and that's okay. The important thing is to keep thinking, questioning, and seeking truth. These discussions are not just about abstract ideas. They are about how we live our lives and how we understand the world around us. So, as you finish this book, take a moment to reflect on these ideas. How do they fit with your own beliefs? What questions do they raise for you? The journey of exploring these deep questions is ongoing, and it's a journey that can enrich your understanding of yourself, others, and the world. Keep asking, keep exploring, and keep growing.